I'm joined here today by Zaid, Dahhaj, and if anybody at all follows health topics on Twitter, they're probably familiar with some of the threads, some of the extensive threads that Zaid puts out on everything from light exposure to grounding to water. You seem to be an amazing health coach, Zaid. You've helped a ton of people. But the thing I love is you get into topics that are not very mainstream, right? Like these are things that mainstream medicine does not even touch. I mean, forget about mainstream medicine. They don't touch these topics, but even just mainstream health in general, I don't think there's a lot of good information out there. And it's funny, a few of the topics we'll talk about today, light exposure, grounding, and water. Light exposure, I think Huberman kind of popularized it, right? It's coming from this neuroscientist. As far as the mainstream is concerned, go get your sunlight outside. But before that, I never heard anything about light exposure. And so let's start with that. Okay, let's start with that. I want to understand the importance of light exposure and what are people getting wrong about light? Like what is going on? Why do we think the general health population or the general population of the US, why do we think the sun is bad? And what are we getting wrong about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's certainly a great topic. I think so far in my research, it's one of my favorite topics to dive into because, in my opinion, light is one of the most fundamental aspects to our biology. I like to take on the lens of evolutionary biology. So, just the way that we evolved as a species, light has always been a part of that equation. Natural sunlight, mainly. So, with the advent of artificial light, quote unquote alien light, these things this form of lighting is very new to us, new to our species, and as a result, it's having a lot of second, third, fourth order biological consequences that we really can't account for because only, in my opinion, only a fraction of the population understands light at its best and from a comprehensive perspective. Like I'm doing a lot of research on this subject, and I feel like I'm only tapping into maybe 1% of it so far. And it's daunting because you have to look into certain things. You look at PubMed, you have to piece things together, and it takes a lot of work to really understand the full scope of this. But I think the demonization of sunlight really comes down to number one, ignorance, and number two, profit motive. So of course, you have large conglomerates selling sunscreen, sunglasses, and while I do see those tools as valuable within a very specific and narrow context, I think by largely, I think they're doing more damage to our physiology than good.
So let's actually talk about that specifically. So I think you brought up a very significant point. It is hard to understand biology without the lens of evolutionary biology. And all life on Earth evolved with the sun, right? With the sunrise and the sunset. And it just makes sense. It has a massive impact on physiological functioning. And in fact, both of us, I think, when we work with clients, one of the first things or one of the contexts we use is we want to work with them in the context of circadian biology. The more aligned they are with circadian biology, the better their health outcomes are going to be, right? We live in a very random environment, modern environment, light exposure at all times. This is not how we evolved, right? So that makes sense. I think that makes sense. Like, so targeted light exposure, the sunlight is actually very useful. And then you brought up another point, the profit motive of companies, right? So what you're referring to, obviously, like sunscreen companies, all these companies, they can make us fearful of the sun. And the idea here is, I think, and you tell me about this, by the way, but the idea here is the sun does cause damage too, right? The sun does cause skin damage. Okay, we know that for a fact, but that could maybe be mitigated to some degree. But the bigger worry that I think has been put in a lot of people's heads is the cancer worry, right? Like I know people who are just afraid to death to get any sunlight because, first of all, they think they're going to get darker. It's going to cause some skin damage and make them all wrinkly, and they're increasing risk of cancer. These are like Indian people and stuff like that. Like they're afraid of like skin cancer. So tell me why this shouldn't be a worry for people.
Absolutely. So on the first point that you mentioned in terms of the sun causing skin damage, I completely agree. But here's the perspective that people are missing out on. I don't think people really appreciate the hormetic effect and just hormesis in general, because when you go into the gym and you push yourself to a certain extent, you're damaging your muscles. I mean, if I were to have you take a blood test after you train, your metabolic profile would look disastrous. It would look like you have cancer or some other crazy chronic condition. So this is how the human organism evolved. We are designed to build a callus in multiple respects. So of course you have the callus in terms of like the training context. You have the solar callus, which I'm a big fan of. But your body has this innate mechanism to protect yourself from that damage. Yes, it is technically damage, but again, the lens of hormesis is extremely valuable
It
to understand this subject from.
Yeah, and let's also go deeper into that. So when you say hormesis, you're talking about a small stressful effect that could actually lead to growth, right? Like an acute effect that could lead to positive adaptation is really what we're talking about, and that's actually a good point because people get confused between acute and chronic stressors, right? Like muscle damage when you're weightlifting is great if you have the recovery, but if you always are lifting that weight, your muscle's going to fall off and die, right? Like so you need the periods of growth and recovery to lead to the positive adaptation is what you're referring to. And so you say that if we take that into account, we should not have to worry about sun damage to our skin. Like if I go out to the sun right now for like 30 minutes and, I can slowly increase my solar callus, am I not aging more rapidly, because of the sun exposure?
So, in my opinion, I think the modern environment is set up to create what we refer to as atrophic skin. So, essentially, you just have skin that's weak and dysfunctional. And we can talk about the various sources that create atrophy of the skin, like artificial blue light, which I often refer to as toxic because a lot of the research can back that up. You could talk about adding sunscreen, wearing sunglasses, wearing contact lenses. Those three main tools that I just mentioned also they block the biological signal for your body to create melanin. And I find it particularly uh, ignorant and nefarious for large institutes such as the Skin Cancer Foundation to say that there's no such thing as a safe tan, when we know that almost every aspect of our body contains melanin. Your ears contain it, your eyes contain it. Um, Regardless of your genetic background, you have melanin, whether that come in the form of pheomelanin, eumelanin, neuromelanin. So again, when you look at the biological perspective on this, I think I think most people are just trapped within a vicious cycle because their modern environment leads to atrophic skin. But if you approach sunlight through various methods properly, then you're able to avoid any atrophy of the skin, and you're able to get the benefit of melanin and all these other things.
Mm-hmm. So let's touch on two things. One is what can we do to avoid atrophy of the skin, and what are the actual benefits of someone who does get this light exposure? All right. So what are your suggestions to ensure that our skin is not aging faster and that we're avoiding sun damage and building the solar callus?
So first and foremost, as much protection as you can from artificial blue light, what we refer to as alien light, because we know for a fact through research, and you can search this up on PubMed. We have evidence that artificial blue light, isolated blue light, damages the retina, damages the mitochondria within the retina, reduces ATP production, creates reactive oxygen species. And what's interesting is that your eyes and your skin, and of course your brain, it's a natural trio, but your eyes, brain, and skin are made of the same tissue. Or I believe it's the brain and the skin are made of the same tissue when you are an embryo in your mother's womb.
Embryologically, yeah, they're derived from the same things.
Yeah, I think it's neuroectoderm, but if you're damaging the eye through isolated artificial blue light, then what impact does that have on the skin, knowing that they're the same tissue? So, I'm taking a very first principle approach to this, and it's not like a lot of this is not woo at all. There's a lot of research on PubMed and other various journals that explain the mechanisms behind this. But again, it's extremely difficult to piece it together because you're not going to have a randomized control trial on this. You're not going to have, a 20-year cohort or whatever it is.
So you're saying that when we are exposing ourselves to artificial blue light, which, by the way, sitting in front of this computer right now, that's what I'm doing. If we have any sort of LED lighting around us, and most modern environments do. Now, aesthetically, I get it. I hate this type of lighting, right? Just like the aesthetics of it itself. Yeah, I mean, I'm getting a lot more closer to natural light these days. But for the typical person, I think their question is like, there's so many people who do this all the time, like. Is it really that significant? Like what damage is it doing if I'm sitting in front of a computer and I'm not protecting myself against the blue light coming from the computer? What is actually happening?
Sure. So first and foremost, we have to focus on the biology of the eye. So within the retinal ganglial cells within the what is it called? Within the cone, the I forgot what it's called, but essentially there's a high concentration of mitochondria within the eye,
Hmm.
and we know that mitochondria operate efficiently only on two things: red light wavelengths and free electrons. Artificial blue light is not a part of that equation. So as a result, it causes dysfunction in how your mitochondria operate. And I'm a firm believer that mitochondria are the foundation of health. If you want to avoid chronic disease, if you want to maintain good health throughout life, you have to keep the powerhouses of your cells healthy and intact, or else it's not going to work. It's always going to be an uphill battle. So if we're looking at it from a more biological perspective, when you look at a screen that has blue light, and by the way, I have the red blue light blocking thing on the screen right now. Your eye contains something known as neuropsin. This is a protein which essentially acts like a photoreceptor, non-visual photoreceptor. And it's actually a UVA light detector. So speaking from evolutionary biology, your eye and your body is designed to have this, both in the skin and the eye, and I'm sure maybe a few other places. But we have research that shows that artificial blue light directly damages these non-visual photoreceptors. Not only that, it also damages the rods and the cones responsible for sight, both during night and day. And once you damage the neuropsins, then you lead into things like melanopsin, you lead into specific parts of the brain that are responsible for moods, sleep-wake cycles, even neurotransmitter production. So again, it's a very deep rabbit hole, but you can see the mechanistic cause that, or the mechanistic chain that it leads to.
Yeah, and I understand that, and you brought up an important point because we're on the same page when it comes to the fact that mitochondrial health is a great proxy for just total health, right? And just to expand on that mechanism, these are the things that power all of your cells. So if there's any diminishment in their capacity, the cells can't function well, right? If the power plant in the city goes out, Los Angeles is not going to work, essentially, right? And so that's the idea there. I get that, but you're saying that when we are exposing ourselves to the blue light, it is just causing damage on a chronic level. It is causing damage not only to our sight itself, which this is obvious now. I mean, for anybody who's staring at computer screens a lot, they might get myopia, for instance. But you're saying it goes way deeper than that. That it could actually be causing mitochondrial damage to brain tissue. Is that correct?
Oh, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. It's certainly causing mitochondrial damage within the eye, and that's like the first input that your body has in order to start this entire process around circadian biology. So once you, I mean, once you push the first domino, so to speak, what other second, third, fourth, fifth order consequences are there?
Mm-hmm. And what do you think are the physiological manifestations of this then? So, what in the general population then are the outcomes because of this blue light exposure?
Whew. I would say everything from myopia to macular degeneration to even maybe Alzheimer's neurodegenerative disease. We know that it's a potential function or potential dysfunction in neuromelanin, the melanin found in your brain. You can talk about heart disease, cancer. I really think it covers almost every chronic ailment that we have in modern day society. And I think, I didn't touch on this point that you asked me about earlier, but I think a large part of the reason why people have atrophied skin, of course, is in large part due to the modern environment. But if you take a look at the research so far, melanoma rates are skyrocketing. Meanwhile, people are doing exactly what they're supposed to do in terms of avoiding the sun, wearing sunglasses, hats, sunscreen, the whole nine yards. But I think that accelerates the issue and just, of course, creates more atrophied skin, which as a result puts you in a vicious cycle that creates more burning and more severe burns. So
Mm-hmm.
essentially, you have an organism that hasn't adapted to the environment, and
Mm-hmm.
that's the main issue for me, which is why I brought up the hormetic effect.
Mm-hmm. And actually, you bring up a really good realization. I mean, there's this modern environment, but we evolved in a natural environment, and that's still a big part of it. We want to be able to go outside, play, go hiking, do all of these things without constantly worrying about slathering ourselves with sunscreen,
Yeah,
which doesn't really seem normal because other places don't constantly slather themselves with sunscreen, right? I mean, you have
yep,
entire country, they're just outside all day. They'll go under the shady tree during the afternoon, maybe, but otherwise, like, do you have any information on on like the incidence of melanoma or skin cancer in populations that don't utilize sunscreen versus, let's say, in modern America? Have you come across any information regarding that?
Not of yet. I do know that Australia is probably one of the worst in terms of like autoimmune diseases, melanoma, a lot of these chronic conditions. Um, and it makes sense because there's kind of a mismatch there. Like, I think what did Australia start off as a colony or something of that nature? Like
Yeah, it was a
the people
British.
who
They
are
sent all their prisoners there. It's all British
yeah
prisoners who are in Australia, the
yeah.
outlaws.
So essentially, you have people who yeah. So you have people who really didn't adapt to that type of scenario. And, Australia, if you look at the Aboriginals, they're about as dark as you can get because they're adapted to the environment. They have an incredible amount of melanin just all over their bodies. And so um, it begs the question. That is an interesting thing that we need to see. Like, we can look at Aboriginals and we can see what their melanoma rates are, especially considering that most of the day they're in the sun. But um, they're also natural organisms that know when to seek shade. I think we all inherently know when we've gotten too much sun, but the problem is with all the sunscreens and just the improper approach to circadian biology. I think a lot of people have disconnected that intuitive sense of when to
Hmm.
seek shade, so to speak.
This brings up a broader point that different ethnic groups might have different thresholds for sun exposure, right? If we are darker skinned, for me, it doesn't make sense that my threshold for sun exposure is going to be the same as a European white person, right? I mean, it's just, it's going to be, in fact, the evolution of our skin color is likely been driven by sun exposure in certain climates, right? I mean, the reason that Europeans became whiter, for instance, essentially is because the need for more of that sun exposure. So that's a very, very important point. So I guess, so how do we parse this information then for the regular Joe out there who's just, let's just say, for the regular, let's start with a regular white person and then a regular brown person. Like, what do we do to kind of make sure we're maximizing the benefits that you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So thankfully, I think that there's a lot of common themes in terms of what the practical action steps look like to develop that melanin and build that solar callus. Number one, especially if you're lighter skinned and you don't get much sun, focusing more on AM sunlight, which is so anywhere between sunrise to about 8 or 9 a.m. That time frame, and also around sunset, that time frame is much higher in terms of like red light wavelengths that the sun provides, and we have evidence to show that that actually primes your skin for higher UVA and UVB conditions. So if you just get most of your skin exposed during the morning time, and you focus on that religiously, then I wouldn't be surprised if people see less burning, no burning at all, and just a general improvement in skin condition. And the
Mm-hmm.
same applies to any like darker skinned person as well.
Mhm. And that's another point is that I think there's a misconception among the general population that any sort of sun exposure can increase incidence of skin cancer and skin damage. But actually, the important variable there is actually the UV index, right? The UV index is actually telling us how powerful those rays are. And in the morning, I mean, for many people, it's impossible to likely even get a sunburn, right? Like I'm not causing skin damage when the UV index is like under 3, am I?
No, I mean, it's going to be extremely, I mean, you'd really have to be in a very exceptional scenario. Maybe you have like severe melanin dysfunction, photosensitivity, something of that nature where it's a little bit trickier to parse out. But in general, most people are not going to get any damage from that.
Yeah, that's what I figured. But then later in the day, though, let's say mid-afternoon, what about that? Like if I'm going for a walk during lunchtime, what precautions, if any, should I be taking during that time?
So, in my opinion, the precaution that everyone should have at their disposal is just an understanding of what your level of experience with sunlight exposure is. If you never get any sunlight and you think that you're going to be able to withstand 2 to 3 hours of sunlight exposure directly at the highest UVI index, you're in for a a bad surprise because really, again, it's about the level of adaptation that the specific individual has to sunlight so far. So you have to understand the context from which you're starting from. If you don't, you are going to burn your skin, and I will be very clear: burning your skin from sunlight exposure is going to raise your risk of any type of skin cancer.
Hmm. So there is a real risk there, and that does mean there are use case scenarios for sunscreen. Now, we do need to make a distinction between the types of sunscreens, right? Because there are some very artificial sunscreens that have a lot of ingredients in them that actually might be cancer promoting, and then there's what we
Yep.
would call mineral sunscreens that contain things like zinc, for instance, that could be really protective without all the nasty negative long-term effects potentially, right? So, what is your suggestion regarding sunscreen use for a general person?
I'd say if you can, you really have to dial in just the habits around building a solar callus to avoid any sunscreen use. But listen, if you're in a scenario where it's extremely hot, you're out there all day, you know you can't avoid that. Then of course I do default to like a really high quality, non-toxic mineral sunscreen that has zinc oxide. I know Van Man is a popular up and coming company on Twitter. He provides he actually just came out with one, but that's it's difficult to put into words because again, people are stuck in the vicious cycle. They need to understand, like, focusing on AM sunlight, protecting themselves from alien blue light, making sure that they have all these other lifestyle factors in place so that they get to a point where they can withstand more sunlight rather than
Okay.
just defaulting to sunscreen.
Yeah. And when Andrew Huberman started talking about, AM sun exposure, he would just say, get some 10 minutes of AM sun exposure in the morning, and that's going to set your circadian clock for the day, and it's going to help you sleep. Like that was the context of how he explained it, right? But what you're explaining is actually far deeper than that. You're saying the implications are more vast than that, and that you actually need to be more aggressive than that even. So like how much sun in the morning are we talking? Because most of us do not have time or the inclination to spend all morning outside, right? Like I can't. I mean, I got to do work in front of a computer. Unfortunately, I got to
Yeah.
meet with clients and everything else like that. So I would love to be outside a lot, especially since we're on the West Coast. I think both of us are kind of in the LA OC area, so we want to be outside and enjoy the sun. But it's not realistic for the vast majority of the population. So taking that into account, what is the minimum effective dose that a person should be doing?
Listen, as soon as you wake up, anything is better than nothing. I would much rather have someone do 5 minutes consistently every single day of just getting natural light into their eyes in the morning than absolutely nothing and just staying inside. Um, I would say, for people who are really committed, at least 30 minutes in the morning. That is a good rule of thumb to use. And then, of course, if you have time, then just take sun breaks. Fit, really just fill in the gaps in terms of like getting outside as much as possible. And most importantly for me, just again, I'm going to keep harping on this, not using sunglasses. If you have contact lenses, it's a little bit trickier. But really just defaulting to making sure that your bare eyes get natural light. And that doesn't mean looking directly at the sun. I believe in sun gazing. I think you can only do that in a very specific window of time, right where the sun's at the horizon. But in general, after that, it's terrible idea to look at the sun. I think we all inherently know that.
Reminds me of the picture of Donald Trump looking straight at the sun during that. I don't know if you ever see that picture when everyone has sunglasses on. The guy's like this,
Yes.
but I guess he's deriving energy from it or something. I don't know what it is, but good point there. Meaning there's a lot of nuance to this topic, and everybody might have a different threshold and starting point. And but the bottom line is that the sun is not the enemy. It's actually the source of all life on Earth is the sun. The source of all energy on Earth is the sun. Photosynthesis is what creates all energy on this planet. It's plant energy, but then we consume that plant energy, right? And this brings us to other topics because I'm going to get into some details here because we're both familiar with Dr. Jack Kruse. He's a neurosurgeon who's kind of popularized this topic about 10, 12 years ago. Maybe even longer than that. He's been talking about this a long time. He's not mainstream at all. He's kind of in this very specific environment. And but the crazy part is Andrew Huberman has become mainstream. And not many people know about this, but Jack Kruse, Andrew Huberman, of all people, Rick Rubin did about a 6-hour podcast that it's kind of hard to find on YouTube for some reason, but they
Oh,
discussed
yeah.
all of these things, all of these topics, and I want to go into details regarding some of that, and we'll talk about that. And we're going to take a break here, but before we end this segment, like I just want to continue this conversation because we have just scratched the surface, right? We scratched the surface of this, and there's so much deeper to go, so much more information to get there. And a few of the other topics we're going to talk about are things like grounding and water too. Like these are fundamental things, like you said, for just all biology. And I want to talk about the implications for that. So we're going to take a break right here, but then we'll be back talking about more of those things.
Awesome.